Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to welcome you all to the launch of Who Owns Brighton. It's something that's been, I think Helen mentioned that like 4 years in the kind of talking and in the making, and here we are at the launch, and it's really exciting. We are just saying we had nearly 300 people sign up, so it should, hopefully it's going to be a great evening. I'm sure it will be. So just a little bit about Who Owns Brighton. Who Owns Brighton is a series of workshops and events designed to enable people to understand and explore different aspects of the planning and development process and how we as citizens, very importantly, can more actively participate in these processes. My name is Martin and I'm going to be your host for the evening. We have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we start. We will be recording the session. The session is being recorded and it's going to be put on the CLT website. The link for watching the push film is live until the end of Sunday. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it, do. It's great. It's a great film. I've watched it a couple of times. It's worth a watch. And just to say that we've chosen this webinar format for tonight to facilitate the panel discussion, because like I said, we've had nearly 300 people sign up tonight. And if everyone was on the screen, it would be virtually impossible to have a discussion. But the important thing is that you can ask the panel questions and you just use the Q&A function. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a button there. And if you put your questions in that, we will get them to the panel. So what's the running order for the evening? First of all, we're going to be hearing from Mohammed Al-Fridi from the Civic Power Fund, who will be talking about the work that they're doing and why they are excited to be supporting Who Owns Brighton project. This will be followed by a panel discussion, and we have a fantastic set of panelists with us this evening, who you can see here. We've got Dr. Anna Minton, who's an academic, journalist, and author of Ground Control and Big Capital. We've got Sam Freeman from The Shift, a worldwide movement to reclaim and realise the right to housing. We've got Rebecca Searle. Becca is a housing researcher at the University of Brighton, and in 2018, she set up the University of Brighton Housing Forum to explore how the city could work together to address the housing crisis in the city, which led to the development of this project. She has also recently published a book on the history of the housing crisis. We have John Silver, who's joining us from Manchester. He's a researcher at Sheffield University, working with Greater Manchester Tenants Union and Greater Manchester Housing Action, and the author of a number of reports on housing and land in the city. And we have Helen Bartlett from Brighton Hove Community Land Trust, who is a director of the Community Land Trust and a housing activist and a member of two co-ops in Brighton, Bunker and Rosa Bridge, and is program manager for delivering CCH's, or the Confederation of Cooperative Homes, 4 million home programs for the government. So we've got a great panel for you. We also have Anka Swite, who is the Professor of Anthropology and Global Development at the University of Sussex, who is researching student housing cooperatives and also a board member of the CLT. And she'll be asking the panel questions from the audience. So just to say, when we have the panel discussion, each speaker has got 3 minutes to introduce themselves and their work and how it relates to Who Owns Brighton. And this will be followed by 30 minutes-ish of questions and discussion. Following the panel discussion, we'll hear more about the project activities and how people can get involved from Helen. And we're scheduled to end at 8:30. So hopefully that's all the information you need before we kick off. And I think now it's over to Mohammed, if that's all right with you, so you can tell us about the Civic Power Fund and your funding of the project.
Thanks, Martin. I'm really sorry, guys. I don't know why I've been put at the front, and I don't know why I've been given 10 minutes, because I'm probably the least interesting person who's going to speak tonight. But I think because money's involved, people think that like people with money should be put up front, but probably not to be done in the future, I think, because you're going to hear from like some very interesting people tonight. So think of this as like a soft intro of boring stuff. So my name is Mohammed. I work as the Director of Organising at the Civic Power Fund. We are a new intermediary pooled funder, which is a really funny way of saying we are a funder with no money. We spend about half our time going out begging money from large trusts and foundations. And our argument is really that they give out money badly, and we think we can do a better job. And the Civic Power Fund started as people who had been applying for funding for a long time and were just really frustrated at the way it worked and frustrated at what got funding. So we have a dual aim as a fund. Our first aim is justice for oppressed communities. And we have a really, depending on who you speak to in the fund, there's only three of us, but there's a real spectrum in that Martha, our CEO, thinks that justice is attainable, and I think it's a pipe dream, and Zane's somewhere in between. But the one thing all three of us agree on is that there can be no justice without power, and that you can get no power without organized communities who can take that power for themselves and exercise it. So that's really all we fund. We fund communities that come together to take power, to challenge power, to influence power, and to enter decision-making spaces. Last year, we ran something called the Community Action Fund, where we opened up applications for grants of around £20,000 to anyone who was doing that kind of work in the country. We had only existed for about 11 months when we launched that. So we thought about 200 people max were going to apply because no one had heard of us. In the end, we had 7,500 organizations fill out the eligibility form. We had 950 organizations across the UK, groups of people who were coming together, who put in full applications. And we ended up taking 100 of those applications and writing up sort of grant memos with them. The 100 best applications were then sent to an independent panel outside of the fund of people who do community organizing and power building on a daily basis. And they were asked to review. And Brighton Hove Community Land Trust came out on top. It was one of the 18 groups that were selected out of that 7,500 as a group that was building power, that was bringing its community together, that had an idea and a project that would impact and make people's lives better. And we're really excited to be funding it. And this is my first time being a funder, and I can tell you it's the easiest job in the world, because you just give someone money and they do all the work. And I think tonight you're going to hear from an amazing panel who are actually going to do all the work, and who are going to bring the many things that were written on a very short application form into life and fruition. And it's really great to hear that John's been working with Greater Manchester Tenants Union, because that's one of the other organisations we support in the country. If you want to find out about who the Civic Power Fund gives money to, where we get our money, things like that, you can go to civicpower.org.uk. And one thing I'll just give you a heads up on is last year we were really happy with what happened with the Community Action Fund. And this year we've been able to raise money again, to do it again, but for youth organising specifically. So yeah, please stay in touch with the fund, check out our website, because hopefully there'll be an opportunity for any young people who are on this call who want to organise and challenge power to get some funding, and the decisions will be made by other young people, we hope. But yeah, I think I've run out of things to say, guys. 10 minutes was way too much, but I hope that...
That's fantastic. No, thank you so much. I mean, that just, yeah, I mean, what to say? You said it all. That's fantastic. That's so great. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. So, I mean, that just gives us more time for a discussion, which is always a good thing, right? So thank you. Yeah. So just before we do have the discussion, and just following on from what you said, I think I'm just going to say a little bit more about the project, just to remind everyone. So Who Owns Brighton sets out to explore what is being built in the city, who is it for, and how we as citizens can more actively participate in this process. And development is happening all over the city. I mean, you can see there's cranes everywhere. There's development going on everywhere. Well, in a lot of places. But the questions we're asking are, what is being built? And does it meet the needs of the citizens in the city? What kind of city is being built? Who is it for? Who has the power? Who gains and who loses? And crucially, can we change what happens? And what could that change look like? We'll run a series of workshops that enable people to better understand different aspects of the planning and development process. Groups will then work together to research chosen areas around the development that has already happened, and that's Circus Street in Brighton. That was a partnership between Brighton and Hove City Council and the developer U&I on some council-owned land. We will research what happened and when, the different parties and stakeholders involved, what the scheme tried to do, whether it achieved it, how it was funded, what it produced, and how people, very importantly, how people experience it now. We'll consider what, if any, points of intervention there might have been, and having gathered this information, we'll then collectively decide how to present the results and how we can use these results to engage with local decision and policymakers. Helen will be talking at the end, like I mentioned earlier, at the end of the session about the different workshops and how people can get involved. So that's kind of it for me, really. So let's move on to the panel discussion, and I'd like to invite Dr. Anna Minton to kick us off. So Anna, over to you.
Hi there. Thank you very much for inviting me, everybody. Just to give you an idea of who I am and why I'm here, although I live in London. I've written 2 books. The first is called Ground Control: Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century City, which focused on the privatisation of UK cities. Um, and the second is called Big Capital: Who is London For?, which looks at the housing crisis in London and in UK cities more widely, and is equally relevant to what has been happening in Brighton. And what my work tries to do is look at the dynamics of the changing city and the processes which lie behind the huge changes which cities like Brighton have experienced over the last 15 years or so, and in particular since the financial crisis. And I'm continuing to look at this work with a new book I'm writing, which is called Superprime: The Sterilisation of the City, which from the title you can tell is basically very much focused on the extreme gentrification which happens with incredibly high property prices, which push out the diversity of interests, of people, of communities, and just leave us with these hollowed out and very sterile spaces. So tell me when I've talked for too long, Martyn. What I've really focused on in my work in recent years is looking at how the housing crisis, we've had a housing crisis ever since I've written about housing, which is far too long, about 25 years. But actually, it was the financial crash which put us into a completely different place. And that's as a result of a series of factors, one of which is monetary policy. So the impact of policies like quantitative easing, which created huge amounts of new money, and combined with a period of very low interest rates, this created a permanently inflationary environment. And the biggest reason we've got a housing crisis is because nobody can afford to buy housing. And they can't only afford to buy, they can't afford to rent either. And there are a number of factors which kind of come in combination with that, which I explore in my work, such as the increasing role of new players, such as investment funds, private equity companies, who have an ever greater role in owning the housing in cities, and also actually the role of dirty money, which is a big theme in Push, the film that you've all got the free link to. Push looks at the role of Blackstone, which is the biggest private equity company in the world, the biggest private landlord in the world, and it also looks at the role of dirty money. And actually, it's these forces which are in very large part behind the housing crisis. Of course, in the UK context, there are other factors as well, such as the sell-off of 2 million council homes and the decimation of social housing. So I try to explain the dynamics of how we've got to where we are today. The way I see your event and the work of Mohammed's Civic Power Fund is that actually your communities have become so disempowered by these dynamics, and you're trying to disrupt that really and provide some spaces where communities can actually empower themselves to some degree. So I think I'll probably leave it there. I think I've done my 3 minutes.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think that leads us nicely over to Sam, if you wouldn't mind going next.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here. It's very daunting to be on this panel with so many incredible people. Extremely daunting to talk about financialization after Anna talks about financialization, but I'll go ahead anyway. So, yeah, my name's Sam Freeman. I'm the director of legal research and advocacy for an organization called The Shift, which was set up by Leilani Farha, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing and the protagonist of Push, the film, which you have the link for through this event, and an incredible advocate called Julieta Peruca, who worked with Leilani when she was Special Rapporteur, and yeah, is very, very highly regarded in the kind of human rights field. The Shift was kind of set up to carry on the work that Leilani did when she was Special Rapporteur, and in particular the kind of work that she did on what we call the financialization of housing. So a real focal point for the work of The Shift is looking at how these fundamental changes in our housing systems are impacting on the enjoyment of human rights. So what we've seen in the last 30 years, we've seen the kind of development of what I often call an economic addiction to residential real estate all around the world, in the UK, but kind of a lot in the UK and the US, but all around the world, it's developing more and more and more. And what's happened with that is this kind of addiction to residential real estate is moving us further and further away from the full realization of the human right to housing. What has happened is financialization has turned housing into an asset class. It's turned it into a vehicle for profit that can be bought and sold on global markets, and the effects of that are clearly evident in Brighton. This is, it's incredible to do a project like this in Brighton, which is seeing the impacts of financialization so clearly. But as I said, throughout the UK, throughout the world, we're seeing the impacts of financialization on the human right to housing, and it's unbelievably far-reaching. We're not just talking about traditional forms of housing. We're not just talking about ownership and rental housing anymore. We're talking about things like care homes are becoming financialized. We're talking about student housing becoming financialized, which is, I know, happening in Brighton and many other cities across the UK. We're talking about social and affordable housing becoming financialized. Short-term rentals like Airbnb, which are harming our cities, are a form of financialization. In the UK, we've seen homeless shelters become financialized recently to disastrous effect. It's so far-reaching and it's so damaging, and the level of financialization, the level of private investment that's being made into housing, I think really denotes a kind of shift in our understanding of what housing's for. We've moved away from a social understanding of housing being a place where people can live in peace and security and dignity, which is required under international human rights law. And we've moved towards an economic understanding of housing being a place to grow wealth for people who are already wealthy. And as a result of that, much of what's being kind of constructed all around the UK and in Brighton, it's not being constructed based on need anymore. It's being constructed based on what's profitable for shareholders. We don't see companies coming in and building, looking at, okay, this is what the demographic of our city is, this is what people actually need, this is the housing they need. They're not. They're looking at what's profitable. They're looking at luxury. They're looking at short term, and that's deeply, deeply harmful. When you have decisions that are being made about housing that are investment decisions, profit-driven decisions, those decisions typically are inconsistent with the human right to housing. Since our inception, I work closely with tenants all around the world who are living in financialized housing, and I can talk later about this because I'm going on at length, but the effect is almost identical every time an investor takes over. We see the effects, we see how they do it, how they come to own the property, and we see how they come to exploit their tenants in order to generate profit. So the Shift's work since we kind of started has been to draw light on this phenomenon of housing financialization, to link it to the human right to housing, to allow people to understand how human rights are fundamental, and that fundamental is being breached by financialization in the UK and all around the world. As I said, we work with tenants, we work with governments, we work with investors sometimes to help them come to terms with their human rights responsibilities. We have written, which I'll share if I can, a document, the Shift Directives, which are a kind of framework for how government should move away from a financialized system of housing and towards a system that privileges housing as a human right. So yeah, I think there's loads of parallels with the work that we do and with what this project's trying to achieve. I'm really excited to be taking part in this event because of those parallels. I think this Who Owns Brighton is kind of at its core a kind of human rights exercise. It's about claiming housing as a human right, about realizing what housing's for and what it needs to be for. So I'm going to stop talking now, but yeah, delighted to be taking part and looking forward to the event.
Well, thank you. No, thank you very much, Samuel. I think those themes, yeah, are really pertinent. So Becca, if you'd like to tell us about yourself and your work, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Becca. I'm a historian of the housing crisis. And my interest in this project, and actually the reason I do housing research full stop, is that I've lived in this city nearly 30 years, just over 30 years now. And over that time, particularly in the last decade, I don't think there's anyone in this city who can be oblivious to the fact that the housing crisis has just got worse and worse and worse. Yet the strange thing is, as we walk around the city, we see all the skyline is absolutely full of cranes hoisting new developments into being. So the origins of this project were a conversation, I think, with me and Helen. And Helen, I'll give Helen credit for putting it so articulately. The simple question we want to know is why, despite the amount of development that's happened in the city, why is it that the housing crisis year by year by year gets worse and worse and worse? And as a historian, I'm really quite acutely aware that this is a phenomenon of the present, and that it's going to show my age, but in the very recent past, things were a lot better. So what I do in my book is I show the way in which across the 20th century, people's access to decent, secure and affordable housing increased because of council house building, rent controls and rent regulation. And by about 1980, we get a situation where the British have been better housed than they ever have been and they ever will be. Because what happens in the 1980s is we don't just see the removal of policies that we know work, like council housing and rental regulations. We see the emergence of a very different kind of housing policy, a housing policy that doesn't seem actually to aim to house people, but is far more concerned with protecting and enhancing all the money that's been invested in the property market, be that by individual owner-occupiers or by the institutions that we've seen since the 1970s. Increasingly, we see these large financial institutions investing in the property sector. Thanks to the work of people like Sam and Anna, we've got quite a good idea actually about what this looks like from a global and a national perspective, but we've got far less idea of what's happening locally. And here I was really inspired by John's work on Manchester, which showed us what we might be able to do in Brighton. I read these reports that tell us that Brighton is the prime source for property, one of the prime areas for property investment in the country, but we don't know where this money is being invested. And we don't know who it is who's investing this money, who is making money out of the housing crisis that is causing so much misery and suffering in our city. So I'm really excited to be working with the panel, but also with the community to try and find out the answer to some of these questions. Because what the history of housing tells us is that this is not a situation that's just going to get better on its own. The massive gains that we saw in the 20th century didn't come about because of some benevolent state or just some natural improvement in policy. They came about because of collective action by ordinary people. In 1915, a group of working class women from Glasgow organised a rent strike that first forced the government to introduce rent controls and then gave them very little alternative but to start building council housing. And in our own age, it feels hard. It feels hard that we don't feel confident that we can make a difference. But what history tells us is that a small group, a local group of ordinary people transformed history and made housing better for millions and millions of people. And we still live with the legacies of that today. So I'm really excited. I mean, maybe this is the eternal optimist in me, but I really do hope that this project could be the start of something that could be really quite transformative, not just for our city, but across the country and actually networking and internationally. I'll stop there.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. That's a great call to arms. Yeah, thank you. So John, over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invite. I'm John Silver. I'm a geographer. I started doing research in my own city after working away around 2015, 2016. Manchester became a boom town. There were skyscrapers going up, but at the same time, homeless camps in the city centre and people struggling to afford rents. I joined a group called Greater Manchester Housing Action, which was a a loose coalition of ragtag researchers, squatters, people looking after kids coming out of care, and people working genuinely across the housing activism spectrum. And one question that everybody had was about who was profiting out of the city's transformation. So given that I don't have many skills in life, but I can do research, we started to follow the money, but also interrogate the planning process, thinking about how Manchester City Council, which is run by the Labour Party, who have something like 95% of the seats, was welcoming this kind of wealth, and what kind of conditions they were putting on. So were they capturing any public value? So 2017, we released our first report called Homes Not Assets, partly inspired by Anna's work in Big Capital, that really used data, making a database, looking at every big development in the city, looking at the planning conditions, looking at the money that was going back into the developers' pockets, looking at the kind of housing that was being built, whether it was for rent or for sale, and then going from there, thinking about the different foreign ownerships, thinking about short-term rents. So it was a really big report. It caused a bit of a splash in the city, given that housing was such a pertinent issue, and it really helped to put housing centre stage for the city. Now, what we realised was you could ask many people in Manchester what was going on, and they knew there was a housing crisis. They could see the big towers and they could see the homeless camps. But what the work that we did was give it a narrative, and more importantly, evidence, so that politicians couldn't so easily say that everything was under control. In the preceding years, we went on to do a follow-up report, another report where we started to look at public land sales, so using freedom of information requests and council insiders to show how Manchester City Council were, I won't use the word giving away, but were transferring land at either nil or lower than market value in order to encourage development. We did a report on short-term rentals and Airbnb, drawing on both some of the big data that's out there, but also working with tenants at the Greater Manchester Tenants Union to document how particular streets in neighbourhoods such as Moss Side were being transformed almost overnight as tenants were kicked out, houses were sold, and short-term residents were brought in. And our final report was a report last year or the year before now, looking at the council's public-private partnership with the Abu Dhabi United Group, owners of Manchester City. We'd long campaigned around the deal, which we felt was wrong for a number of reasons. We'd held public education events. We'd built up a really nice coalition with human rights campaigners at Amnesty and other groups to highlight both how the Abu Dhabi money could shine a light on human rights abuses in Abu Dhabi, but also housing issues and human rights issues in Manchester. So in the last year or two, we managed to actually get some academic money, and we've been working with a professor of forensic accounting, which has really allowed us to take this kind of follow the money research much further. I've learned a lot. You can kind of realize that footnote on page 24 of last year's accounts can be vital to exposing some of these shady relationships. And we've been working with the Tenants Union on a public education programme. The last event was held close by my house in Moss Side, particularly trying to empower Black, Afro-Caribbean and Somali communities that are facing some of the spillover effects of this big development in the city. We have a handbook for tenants, residents and communities to go about doing their own work that should be coming out next month. So just to summarise in a sentence, I've probably been asked here because one of the things that we've done is really try and take the idea that knowledge is power, and really try to make that work in Manchester through doing research and through training and kind of providing technical expertise to communities that are now able to challenge planning processes. And there's a number of great ongoing campaigns in the city communities in Manchester now, in which you have some very technically knowledgeable community members. So sorry if I've waffled on, I am an academic.
No, thank you very much. I think the knowledge is power is something we definitely something we can touch on in the discussion after. So Helen, the virtual floor is yours.
Great. So I'm going to come at this from my involvement in housing co-ops, which is the place I always start. It's the thing I spend most of my time thinking, doing, dreaming, etc. about. And I've been involved in co-ops in Brighton and now nationally for a long time, for over kind of 20 years. And originally, I just joined a co-op because it was like an affordable and secure place that I could live, and not just live, but also have some choice over the life I had and what I could spend my time doing, because I wasn't having to spend all of my time working just to make the rent. So I joined to start with, but then I became really inspired by what co-ops are and what they do and how they can create kind of alternatives to this system that we're in. So I set up with some friends Rosa Bridge, which is where I am now. It's the co-op I live in. It's a small queer housing co-op, just a sort of shared house. And I'm also a member of Bunker, which Martyn is also, and we're building cooperative homes in the city. We're working across council sites, and we've got a few sort of 15 homes in the pipeline. And I'm also, as Martyn said, I'm on the board of the Community Land Trust, looking at supporting the development and cooperative and other community-led housing in the city. And if we've got anyone here who doesn't know what community-led housing is, take a look at the Brighton Hove Community Land Trust website, and that will tell you. So I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and trying to create alternatives to a system that is, whether it's in crisis, whether it's broken, whether it's just fundamentally wrong to start with. And while in Brighton and Hove and in the UK generally, housing co-ops are a really tiny percentage of our housing stock, this doesn't have to be the case, and it isn't the case everywhere. So in Vienna, for example, co-ops represent 25% of their housing stock, and in the Bronx in New York, there's Co-op City, which is home to 45,000 people. So co-ops can form this really mainstream part of how housing is delivered, and if people want to understand more about the legal and financial mechanisms that enable that to happen, I'd advise you to have a look at the Confederation of Cooperative Housing Manifesto, which has just been launched this week, and it's part of the run-up to the elections, how we can make co-ops more part of the housing that we have. But in terms of how this links to Who Owns Brighton, firstly, the possibility to create what we see as alternatives is completely framed by the kind of much bigger choices that are being made about property, land, housing and development. And for me, that question, as for so many of us, I think we're all here in that same way. How, where, why these choices are being made, whose interests they serve, and how we understand that were what motivated us from the start of the project. And I think even more than that, for me, being involved in kind of the development of cooperatives involves this constant engagement and involvement and questioning and negotiation on a very personal as well as a kind of city-based level, what housing is and what it does and what it should do and what it could be and how it could be. It's so important, and how it can be so much better than it is at the moment. And those negotiations, and often because it's cooperative, it's with collectives rather than individuals. And often it's that thing, isn't it? Housing is posited as such an individual thing, individual home ownership. So that process of kind of working and questioning as collectives have totally changed how I see housing, how I see the notion of home, and how I engage through that with the wider city. And this, and Anna mentioned, this feels so absent from what happens on a larger scale, and how I feel when I look at the kind of developments that are happening around us and in this city that's my home and that I love. So the project is about, I want to know if and how we as citizens can impact on this larger scale and can shape and change the future of housing and homes in our city. And in doing that, kind of link up to the wider work and movements that are happening kind of nationally and across the world. So as someone said, we've been talking about Who Owns Brighton for a while. It came out of another project that the CLT ran that was called Push Back Brighton. I think it was like 4 years ago. And after that, we started talking about this. We realized it was the kind of, we watched Push, we heard about Blackstone. We were like, oh, what's happening with this big student development here? Blackstone are involved. You know, we sort of followed that and we started talking about the project. And it's been a long while in coming. Like we talked about it, we came back to it, we applied for different like funding bids about it. You know, we've really kind of gone back and forth. And so it's really, as many people have said, really exciting to be here today. We're really thankful to Pacific Power Fund for kind of seeing the potential that we see in the project and seeing what we think it can do. And it's really brilliant to be here with this panel. You know, each and all of you, your work has like shaped and inspired what we're doing on this project in some way. And to everybody who's watching, yeah, we were delighted that so many people joined up. It really showed the kind of feeling behind and need for the project. And yeah, so very, very pleased to have you with us and really hope you'll kind of stay with us for the journey of the project, which is, as Martyn said, we'll tell you a little bit more about later. So yeah, thanks. I'll hand back to you, Martyn.
Yeah, well, thanks, Helen, and thanks everyone again. So much fantastic work being done. And I guess now is time for us to talk about that. Just to remind the participants that if you want to ask questions of the panelists, please put your questions into the question and answer. Use the question and answer function, and Anka will put a hand up and ask those questions to the panel on your behalf. And also just to remind the panelists that you are very welcome to ask each other questions as well. So do we have a starter for 10 from the chat, Anka, or should I?
We do.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Martyn. First of all, thanks everybody for these fantastic introductions and framing the project. There actually was a question about what does financialization mean? And I know a couple of people answered it, but I was wondering whether it might just be worth to just briefly explain that a little bit more comprehensively so that everybody actually is familiar with this term. And then also Tom, and I think it might be Tom Green from the Searle Housing Cooperative, Student Housing Cooperative, posted a link to a really good video that also introduces financialization into the chat as well. But does anybody want to just speak a little bit more about what we mean by financialization?
I'm happy to say something quickly, and then perhaps Sam would like to say something as well. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Can you hear? Hello? Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I'll give a very simple answer, rather than the sort of more in-depth answer that, you know, I might sort of give in an academic context. But I think really it's about looking at land, housing and property as a commodity with the aim of extracting the maximum profit out of place. And I think Sam already talked about some of this, but rather than looking at the use value of housing, the use value for people needing to be housed, it's all about its exchange value in the market. So yeah, that would be my sort of my simple answer.
Great, thank you.
And then I think there are, you know, then you see the players who come in to this picture, you know, the investment funds and the private equity companies and the interaction with monetary policy.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I can jump in quickly. I mean, Anna, I learned about financialization from you, so so it seems a little bit weird to be coming in after you. But yeah, I mean, what when I talk about financialization, yeah, I'm talking about that shift. I'm talking about that move that we've seen where, you know, previously, as Becca was kind of saying, we used to see housing as a place where we could live in security, as a home, and now really housing's been taken over by things like private equity firms like Blackstone, insurance companies, pension funds are all coming in, and they're trying to take a piece of housing and generate profit from it. So kind of by way of maybe a practical example, what will often happen is a private equity fund firm will set up something which is commonly called a real estate investment trust, which is a very almost like a tax-free vehicle for these organizations, and they will buy loads of homes, and investors can then effectively buy into the rents. So they'll rent those homes out to, they'll buy 100 homes, they'll rent them out to 100 people, all paying £1,000, and then as an investor you can buy a proportion of those rents and you get income based on that. So decisions are then made largely in the operation of that housing. Decisions are then made to maximize that profitability for the shareholders. They have this fiduciary duty to their shareholders, which they almost always, in my experience, regard as kind of sitting on a higher level than their human rights responsibilities or their kind of social responsibilities towards their tenants. So yeah, I mean, it's the assetization of housing financialization. It's turning it into a commodity that can be bought and traded on global markets in order to generate profit.
Thank you, Sam and Anna. Does anyone else, do any other panelists want to speak about financialization? John?
Yeah, I would just add in the spin-off to cities being financialized is that our politicians also become financialized, so that local politicians that are trying to lay claim to it, what they call investment into our cities, which is often a form of extraction, is celebrated. Councillors often go on to work for PR companies or real estate companies that are involved in the financialization. Planning officers are going out drinking with the agents for these large companies. So financialization isn't just the assetization of our housing, but it's also the erosion of our local democracy and the kind of ways in which local politicians will suddenly turn this way to big finance rather than the communities they're supposed to serve.
Helen?
I actually wanted to ask a question of what John just said, linked to it, but it's not a direct answer. Is that all right? Yeah, John, so that's really interesting, and one of the things that I wanted to ask, because one of the questions, the core question I often come from a kind of affordability in the city perspective, and I'm not sure if what's being built in Manchester, I'm aware that social housing is also financialised. But one of the questions that I've had is, in this city that we're in, there's policy commitments to affordable housing. There's councils that have politicians on them who are, their values are like affordable, social housing based, etc., etc. And yet in all of these developments that are being built, there is little to no affordable housing, let alone genuinely affordable housing, the kind of affordable housing that Cameron introduced, 80% of market rents, but there's very little being built. And so that's been one of my questions, what happens, what goes through this process? So I guess what you're saying about how we become financialized as well, is that what you would say was kind of one of the key contributors to that?
Yeah, it's the kind of the shift away from social housing. Austerity's played a huge part in Manchester's budgets, down 400 million per year. But when we look back at around 50,000 housing units that have been built in central Manchester in the last 10 years, only 1% of those have been social or affordable. And that's a deliberate policy, right? The council policy is 20% affordable. The result has been 1%. There's more outside the city centre, but 45,000 housing units, we should have had 9,000 of those as affordable. So it's a deliberate policy choice to attract developers to build a particular type of housing And there's a thing that's probably also happening in Brighton called viability assessments. So developers will say, we want 20% profit. If we build one affordable housing unit, we won't get our profits. And what Manchester Council have done is said, okay, that sounds reasonable. Here's your planning permission. But you can look to examples such as Southwark and Lambeth in London, where they have dedicated teams in their planning departments that will challenge those assumptions and at least capture some public value. And I'm sure Anna could tell me things are not so great in London, but what we see in Manchester is a kind of jealousy that at least in London, the local authority is in some way acting on behalf of a public interest. In lots of cities like Manchester and perhaps Brighton, that might not be the case for various reasons.
I mean, I could just quickly come in on that, just to say that when I was researching Big Capital, what was happening in Lambeth and Southwark and across London with regard to financial viability was a complete scandal. You know, it was really, really terrible. And the situation got to such a pitch, there was pushback. And actually, if things have improved in Southwark, for example, which I know they have, that is because there was pushback. And also there was a change in the political composition of the council. So things were terrible in London, but they have improved a bit. So, you know, that shows you that there's a little bit of leeway for change when the whole farce of financial viability is highlighted. And, you know, clearly that hasn't happened yet in Manchester.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to say about financialization, or shall we move on to another question? I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, great. Anka, do we have another question? Perfect.
Gazillions of questions coming in.
Oh,
Some
great,
really
great.
good ones. Yes, loads and loads of questions. Fantastic for everybody for posting those. So there's quite a few on Brighton specifically. For example, some people want to know what is the number of empty and uninhabited units in newly built developments in Brighton. Ron is wondering about some kind of baseline data that we might already have. Helen wants to know what is emerging from following the money in Brighton. So I don't know if we actually can talk to specifics now, or if this is precisely why this project has been set up to get that data. But does anybody have concrete answers to some of these questions? Number of empty or uninhabited units in newly built developments?
Well, I'm glad you put your hand up, Becca, because I was actually looking at you. I think if anyone here has got any of that,
I don't have data, but I mean, you know, just walk through anything like Circus Street, any of the new developments, walk through those at night and have a look at how many lights are on in the windows. You know, we don't have the data, but we can see that these buildings look really very unoccupied.
I mean, just to add to that, I think it's a really big issue that it's so difficult to get the data, because, you know, we have that same situation, you know, all over parts of London with lots of new luxury apartment developments and in other cities. And the job of getting that data, which is so important, is a really tricky job to do. It can be done. There are some consultancies, property consultancies out there who do have some of that data, and it is possible to piece this together, but it's a real job of research, and I think it would be a really, really valuable one to do.
Sam.
Yeah, I mean, almost to make the same point, I mean, one of the real issues we see, not just in Brighton, in the UK and all around the world, is this lack of transparency that comes with the territory of financialization. As soon as you start financializing housing, this kind of veil goes up, and it's almost, it can in many instances be almost impossible to even understand who owns a particular building. And if you can't understand who owns a particular building, you know, it's almost impossible to understand who lives in the building, you know, how many units empty, things like eviction data. We find it really difficult. There are some incredible efforts being done. There's tenants in Berlin who I've worked with who have just set up a map where they chart every single financialized building in the city to understand just how financialized the city is. But yeah, I mean, from a human rights perspective, transparency is essential. And so, you know, us as researchers or people doing research and data collectors, you know, of course it's on us to be searching for this information, but we also need to be pushing our governments to be forcing transparency, right? Like you can't claim your human rights, you can't effectively claim your human rights without knowledge, without understanding what's going on, what's behind this veil. So, you know, I think that's in my work and in the work of many advocates is a really essential part, is forcing the hand of governments to change laws to require things like beneficial ownership being you know, being made transparent. So yeah, just to add that.
Thanks, Sam. So we've got John and then Helen.
Yeah, just a little pushback to the empty luxury apartment schemes, which people often claim in Manchester, which is not actually true. Occupancy is about 95%. The city's added 100,000 people in the last decade. Perhaps like Brighton, it's a city with huge housing demand. And I think that there's an alternate question, is that if people are living in these houses, how much of the proportion of their rent are they spending in order to live there? So we've had pushback recently that, you know, the city centre, there's working class people living there. Well, there might be, but they're probably spending 50, 60% on rent and bills. So I think just asking the question about whether there's empty housing in these luxury developments is not enough. And we also need to think that people are pushed into these housing situations, which are completely unaffordable if you look at their kind of monthly budgets.
Helen, you had your hand up next.
Sam, go next, because I was going to move on to one of the other questions.
Well, very quickly, I just also say, you know, I completely agree with what John's just said. Actually, it's actually kind of baked into the system of financialization having occupancy, like kind of higher occupancy rates. A lot of the times, if you read the like investor manuals for these companies, they kind of require they say to their investors, you know, we'll maintain like 95% occupancy, because they have to, because that's where the investors are getting their money from. It's the rent they're buying to the rents. So what the threat there is that when we see this a lot, is that when a tenant, or when they get a sense that a tenant might not be able to pay their rent, they will get rid of that tenant as quickly as they possibly can, because that tenant hinders their profitability. In their mind, they're taking up an occupancy slot that could be filled with a more, in their world, reliable tenant or a higher income tenant. So yeah, I think that for me is kind of really where the occupancy the fear with the occupancy often comes in. There is definitely issues with occupancy in different tenure forms, but in a financialized context, that is one of the ones we see quite regularly.
I was just gonna answer the what have we found out about following the money. Yeah, and I'm going to say we haven't, when we started the project, actually, Becca and I did start doing some research into Circus Street. So we did explore some of these pathways of what happened on that specific development. But where this project is focused is on actually like forming community researchers, training us collectively to look at different aspects of the planning and development process. So one of those is going to be very much training people how they can follow the money, and what happens when you train a group of people to do that, and what do they then go and find out, and what can we do with that information. So it's it's not a project in which we're looking at doing that research ourselves. It's a project in which we're looking at using community research, I guess, as a way to inspire movement and activism and engagement with our policy and decision makers around housing. So we don't have any particular results at the moment, but the period of the next 6 months is going to be kind of shaping that process and those questions and sort of what we find out. And we decided to, when we focused on the project, we decided to focus on a specific development, and we decided to focus on a development. If you know Circus Street, if you're Brighton based, it's a development that I think was completed in 22, so it's already happened. There's obviously lots of developments that are in process at the moment that we could have chosen to look at, because we could have engaged in that kind of campaigning aspect as it was, but we decided we'd take one that had already happened. And I think that has lots of people have positive views about Circus Street, lots of different views, there's lots of different perspectives on it. So we could look at it, so we could engage in it as a kind of case study to build those skills, to build those knowledge, to look at what happens when you investigate it, in order that people then go and do it, and that process of where it kind of takes us. So yeah, that's the kind of, it's a very exploratory project, which at times, I think for everybody in the working group, at times feels quite chaotic and quite unsure, but I think also feels, well, to me, yeah, certainly feels really, really exciting. Like, where's it going to go? Where's it going to lead us? And that's a really nice thing to be involved in.
Thank you, Anka.
So then there is another group of questions more focused on alternatives. And one was already mentioned. I think Helen talked about the Vienna model, and somebody wanted to know whether that is actually a good model to maybe advocate for more effective council housing. Douglas wants to know whether there are platforms for communities to buy property as collectives. So again, that housing cooperative element. And then Ron was talking about models where maybe students or younger workers who are moving to Brighton might want to live with older people in order to be able to afford living. And I know there's European countries who might have some of these models of intergenerational living. So I don't know if anybody wants to maybe speak a little more to some of the alternatives.
I'm just going to drop in the chat a link to a report by some other members of Greater Manchester Housing Action called Housing Futures, that asks the question, what can community-led housing achieve for Greater Manchester? It was done a few years ago. There has been some positive developments since, although, again, if you're facing a local authority that's in bed with the developers, reportedly, that has not been as widely taken up as we hoped, but I'll drop it into the chat now.
Anyone else wants it? Becca.
Yeah, I mean, I can come in a little bit about council housing. It seems madness that we stopped building council housing. It worked really well. And from, even if we adopt a kind of a more right-wing point of view, it makes a lot of economic sense. At the moment, the amount that we throw away on housing benefit, I mean, not throw away, but, the money goes, it doesn't come back to the state, it doesn't do anything. It's a far better investment from the perspective of the state to actually build bricks and mortar, build houses, so that, the building of houses stimulates the economy. There's all kinds of interesting things we could do about how we build council housing. It returns an investment on it. And if you ever need to sell it, you've got an asset that you could sell potentially. And in comparison, housing benefit just seems madness. So we understand that the reasons why we're not pursuing council housing anymore are purely ideological. And there are, though, limitations of council housing. We do look back with, rosy tinted spectacles at the moment from our current housing situation. But there were always problems with the council housing, such as the lack of agency that tenants felt about their living environment. And it's one of the reasons why I actually find the co-op sector so exciting, because there are ways in which the co-op sector could fulfill the functions that council housing does, but do it even better, because they give people agency and control over their living environment. And they're also safe. They're far safer than council housing that can just be sold off at the drop of a hat. Cooperatives have measures in to ensure that housing remains as affordable housing. So for me, you know, we're in such an emergency right now, I think, with housing, that we need to actually pursue every single fund. We need to push for council housing. We need to push for co-ops. There's all sorts of things we need to push for. And yeah, the Vienna, I'm not an expert on Vienna. I don't know if anyone else on this panel is, but what I know, it does look amazing and interesting. And it is a much more mixed form of housing than we have in this country.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to that, or should we move on to Becca? Your hand is, did you put your hand up again? No. Oh, Mohammed, please do.
Oh, guys, I know nothing, so it's strange being on this panel. But what I might just do is I can give you some examples of other groups that we've encountered, funded, and work with. I think one group, it's really interesting. Sam mentioned them earlier. Was a group organising in Berlin. I'm going to have to Google their name because I won't be able to pronounce it. But they managed to organise the residents of Berlin for a referendum on whether landlords who own over 35 houses should be made illegal. And they won that. They won by, I think, 59% the vote. They won it a long time ago and nothing has happened because the level of entrenched power that a lot of those developers and landlords had has meant that it's taking a lot longer. But one of the outcomes has been a massive improvement in the amount of social housing and social housing policy around it, because I think it scared enough people that number of people took action. So it's a really interesting one. I will find it. I won't even try and pronounce it, but I will find it and post it in the chat. And there's just some other interesting examples in the UK of organisations that have mobilised around land. One really good organisation is Housing Action Teesside, which if you haven't heard of, I really recommend going and having a Google of them. They sort of, I think, if you remember the £60 energy rebate we all got from the government, they realised that a lot of social housing in some tower blocks in Teesside Valley didn't receive that because they were classed as enterprise, because the social housing they lived in was owned by a business, and therefore they were subletting from a business and weren't allowed. And these are people in social housing for which this law was passed, but they managed to mobilise really effectively, get their councillors on board, get their MP on board, and actually have the law changed so that people in that form of housing around the country could get money. And they're a really interesting test case of how a very small local group had a massive national impact. And another really interesting group that I direct you to is Ward's Corner Development Project in Tottenham, which basically started off as this. It was the largest Latin Quarter market in Europe, just above Tottenham Station. And it was council owned, and the council realised that they could redevelop it in a very expensive part of London and make a lot of money. And so for about 15 years, the Latin community has been fighting developers who have wanted to come in and redevelop this area. And in the last sort of 3 years, they have switched their tactic from we're no longer going to fight the developers, but we're going to become the developers, and are now in the process of putting in a bid for, I think, a £25 million redevelopment that will centre the Latin community in Tottenham as both like the architects of it, the owners of it. It will be run by a one member, one vote community organisation that anyone in Tottenham can join. And they're just a really interesting example of someone who started up as a campaign fighting something, turned into a campaign to build something, went up against a very hostile local government and very hostile local council, had sort of developers come in new forms to pretend to be the most progressive possible developers you could have, and have slowly had to fight off local government and developers, and are now in a position where I think they're looking really likely to win. So yeah, just there are examples of small groups who have come together and done amazing things across the UK and Europe.
Great. Well, Helen and then John.
Yeah, so I was just going to say about that there's some specific questions there about kind of groups and co-op or community-led housing models that are available. So I would say start off from the Brighton Hove Community Land Trust website, also look at community-led homes. There's examples of kind of, you know, what's happening in the city. There's examples of what's kind of happening nationally. And the CLT website talks about how we've kind of tried to promote that over you know, the past 4 years, there's which has seen some government investment, although that's kind of tallied off now into cooperative and community-led housing in the country. I would say that in order to really scale up and to develop models, like to make it larger and to make it a bigger part, there needs to be those kind of policy, legal and financial changes that need to happen, especially in situations in which it's now so tilted towards kind of developments and private finance and private interest. And as I said, the Confederation of Cooperative Housing Manifesto talks about what some of those legal and financial mechanisms could be. The co-op movement in particular, like, it's got a really long history that isn't just housing, right? We all know what co-ops are in kind of different sectors. It's got a very, very strong value base that's about kind of democratic engagement and participation. And the other thing it has that I think we could kind of, it also, like, it contains, massive shops, banks, etc. It also has there is also an asset base within that cooperative movement that I think could be mobilized better to sort of support housing. So an answer that goes very much to kind of specific projects, to some of the things and some of the mechanisms that are needed to really kind of build that within how we see and conceptualize housing in the country.
John, please.
Yeah, just to quickly jump on Mohammed's point about moving from a more contestation and resistance against what's happening to our cities to thinking about alternatives as a way of forming a community itself. So in inner city Manchester, in Hume, a small bit of land that the developers have got about 20 years left on the land before it goes back to the council. So it's in a kind of intermediary state. They wanted to build student housing in an area where lots of old people have lost their community facilities. The campaign called Block the Block, which has a really nice short documentary covering it, went from opposing the student housing and lots of old people showing up at the council chambers and pressuring the councillors to reject the proposition, to working with some socially engaged architects. They are out there, and in fact think they also are the same architects that have worked in the Latin Quarter in Tottenham, and have come up with a really great proposition for older housing with community facilities underneath. And the application's been rejected 4 times, and we don't know if eventually the councillors will flag it through. But by giving an alternative, it's at least put something on the table and offered a different future. In the meantime, a community of people have really come together, and instead of just being frustrated about what's happened, have kind of taken things into their own hands. It's been really great to see. I'm going to try and find the documentary and throw it into the chat.
Yeah, so thank you for everyone for sharing their links in the chat. Thank you, Mohammed, for sharing the stuff you just put in there. I think it's really useful. So, Anka, do we have another question?
We do, but can I really quickly respond to John on student housing, because it's been mentioned a number of times. It's an area I research, and I know there are quite a few people working on student housing cooperatives in the audience. So I'm just going to speak for them because they can't speak. And Student Co-op Homes is a national umbrella organization, and they're actually currently working with a group of students in Manchester and actually house hunting to set up the first student housing cooperative in Manchester. And also want to say that Searle worked together with the Community Land Trust and funded a Brighton and Sussex student housing cooperative, which opened a couple of years ago. So there is stuff happening on the student housing front as well in these more alternative housing provisions. So quickly just wanted to put this out there. There's a couple of quite technical questions that I just want to put together. Somebody is asking, are neighborhood plans a good idea to maybe work against the financialization? Could a land value tax help? Or legislation to ensure planning permission is granted in tandem with transparency of the ownership of buildings. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody wants to take on these more technical or quite specific question in terms of, again, what can be done there is a larger question about how can we counter the financialization? How can we definancialize housing? And these are just some concrete questions people have about
Yeah,
what
I
might
mean,
be done.
I can take on some aspects of that. I mean, like you say, it's part of a larger question about how we approach the whole issue of financialization. And if we decided to shift ideological direction, then all sorts of things are possible. And it's really not rocket science. And within those things which are possible, a land value tax would, I think, be a very good idea and has been looked at a number of times by cross-party government commissions. And there's a lot of political support for it across parties. And, you know, versions of a land value tax exist in lots of parts of the world, in parts of the US, in Hong Kong, in parts of Australia. But, you know, despite the support for it, we are in hock to the big developers. And therefore, we haven't made any headway with it. So, you know, it's just part of that bigger question of where are we going ideologically. But yeah, a land value tax would make an absolutely huge difference. And actually, when the planning system was first constructed, the modern planning system, it was constructed with the aim of recouping the gains given that land makes when it gets planning permission. Those gains were meant to be recouped for social benefit and infrastructure. And we've basically got rid of that side of the planning system virtually. And a land value tax would start to bring it back. So yes, of course, it would. And I think there were a couple of other aspects to the question which I now can't remember. Neighbourhood plans, I mean, again, you know, within the superstructure, I don't know how much can be done within the superstructure of the dynamics of all the various private partnerships. I mean, the question on accountability and transparency, well, of course, you know, if local authorities were to sign up to, you know, more accountable frameworks, this would make a huge difference. But that's part of the larger question.
Thank you, Becca.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to come in on land taxation. I think it's a massively important thing that we need to think about. I mean, land taxation and wealth taxation together. You know, one of the biggest problems, if we think in terms of the kind of dominant logic, you know, one of the biggest problems the country's facing is a productivity crisis. It's been a productivity crisis now for decades and decades and decades. And most of our taxation comes from taxing work and productivity. It doesn't come from taxing wealth. Lots of people might have heard of Thomas Piketty's book, his book on inequality. And what we know is that most of the inequality that has been generated over the last 30, 40 years actually comes from property. He might as well have called the book, it was essentially a housing book, even though that's not there. And lots of things like land taxation and rent controls, they seem these kind of very radical and bold, dangerous alternatives. You know, rent controls were the norm in this country. We had them from 1915 to 1988. Land taxation as well, it was introduced in 1909 in this country. Massive campaign at the end of the 19th century. It's introduced in 1909. Very, very controversial. It's one of the factors that saw the House of Lords losing their power of veto. It transformed our democratic system. But unfortunately, the First World War happened and the kind of political energy behind the land taxation vanished. But yeah, there are lots of answers within the past and inspiration that we can take in some form or other.
Thank you. Sam, I think you wanted to come in on that, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, just really to say that yeah, all things like imposing additional taxes and imposing transparency requirements, things like rent controls, they're all essential actions that should be taken. But we also need to recognize that tinkering at the margin, as it were, like doing kind of individual actions to try and combat financialization, is unlikely to work. Financialization is our housing system, right? It defines our housing system. Almost every form of housing is in some way in the UK and abroad, and particularly in like the US and North America, is influenced by the power of financialization. So in many ways, what I think we maybe need is a fundamental reimagining of our housing system. It's moving away from this notion that housing can be used as an investment. You know, why should we allow a thing that is so fundamental to human well-being to be operated in a way that is intended to generate profit at the expense of people's lives and livelihoods and dignity and well-being, right? We need to almost take it off the table. I believe that every instance of financialization of housing that we've seen around the world so far has only ended in just awful outcomes for tenants. I mean, I work with tenants who are living in financialized housing all the time, every day, and you know, I very rarely find examples of tenants who are thriving living in financialized housing. At the end of the day, they are often living in uninhabitable conditions because their landlords cut things like service provision, they cut maintenance, they cut pest control to save money. They're living in deeply unaffordable conditions because their landlords will raise rents as much as they possibly can. They will often, as I said earlier, find themselves evicted far more easily than other tenants might, because you know it can be incredibly profitable to evict a tenant to replace them with a higher income tenant. So I don't believe that maybe that's my first point. I don't believe that we should tinker around the margins. I think we need something kind of far more market shaping to combat financialization. I also think we need an international response. Financialization is an international phenomenon. The actors involved in it in Brighton and other places in the UK are often based in the US. They often have arms in Germany, in France, in Spain, in many other countries. And we've seen certain providers will do their kind of dirty work in one city and then they get found out and they just shift their operations to another city. You know, they just cause terrible outcomes for tenants in another city. We're not combating financialization, we're just moving it around when we kind of go in hard in one particular place. So I think we need an international response. I think we need to bring tenants, I think we need to bring advocates, we need to bring researchers together internationally to work out a solution. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sam. Anka, before we take another question, I just want to check with Helen. How long? We've only got 10 minutes left. I want to check how long do you think how long would you like at the end?
Hours.
Oh, no, because I think
5
it's
minutes.
important. Right, are you sure 5 minutes?
5 minutes, and I'm just going to jump in as you've given the floor to me to say to everybody, I'm aware, I think that we've been sharing links in a chat which people can't necessarily see. I will, when I contact everybody afterwards, make sure that I collate all of the amazing like links, etc., that people have been sharing. So you'll have them all afterwards. So yeah, those will get to you.
Brilliant, thank you. So that gives us 5 minutes. So let's have our final question, Anka, please. You're on mute.
I'm just saying there are so many more fantastic questions. I'm really sorry we're not going to get to all of them, but Helen will be able to tell you how you can stay involved. But there is one I think that was posed quite a while ago, and that is about the relationship between so many councils going bankrupt or are in dire financial straits in the UK. And is there a relationship actually to the financialization of housing and to the kind of the prominence of these developers? And then somebody else asked about the possibility of using Freedom of Information Acts, because you all talked about how difficult it is to get this information. Is that one way in which some of this information can maybe be obtained? And that's probably all we have time for.
John's got his hand up. Thank you.
I'll just be very brief. We will circulate our how-to guide next month to Brighton Community Land Trust. It will tell you how to use FOIs. It will tell you how to do different kinds of research, follow the money. And I think research is great. Find out about what's going on in Brighton, use it to embarrass or bludgeon your politicians and create space and pressure for them to be desperate, especially in a time of austerity and bankruptcy, to find some ready-made solutions that people give them on the plate. But firstly, you need to get them in the mood for that kind of alternative. And I think that involves doing that kind of work. So we will circulate that as soon as it's ready.
Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know the answer to this. I would like to know it. But what I do know, which has really surprised me, is that councils very often don't do well out of these deals. You know, I think the expectation might be that councils are getting in bed with various developers and doing these massive schemes, and they're doing it because, you know, they have to act as commercial developers in order to raise money for services, and you know, that's the sort of best value direction, and they're going to make lots of money from it. And then, you know, you get some access or activist groups look at some of the deals and pick them apart, and it's actually quite astonishing what bad deals they are. And it's difficult to get hold of this information. So the only deal I know about was what happened in Southwark with the Haygate estate, which was demolished and replaced by a luxury apartment development, massive site in the middle of central London. And you would have expected that the council would have made tens of millions of pounds from selling that site to the developer. And in fact, they didn't make any money at all, because the amount of money they had to spend demolishing it was the same, about 50 million, was the same as they got from Lend-Lease. So, you know, you're left wondering, why did they do it? And I've talked about this with quite a few people, and we said, well, why do they do it? And the only answer we could really come up with was, you know, they do it because there's such an ideological straitjacket that this is the only game in town. And you have to do it for all the other reasons. You won't get any other development there. You won't get this. You won't get that. So I don't think it's to make money. So in as much as it has a relationship with bankruptcy, I mean, this isn't a very clear answer, but you know, this isn't helping councils financially, is what I'm trying to say, which really surprised me when I found it out.
No, thank you. I mean, I think there's lots of things we want to find out, and I think that leads us very neatly into Helen, who's now going to. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for brilliant questions, great discussion, fantastic answers. So now, Helen, you've got five. There's 5 minutes left. Please tell us about what's going to happen for the rest of the program and how people can get involved and find out these very important things that we've all been talking about.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen, which hopefully everybody who's watching can look at as well. So the next stage of the immediate next stage after this is in the next day or two. We're going to get in touch and send you the links that have been gathered from this chat. We'll send the questions. We're really aware that we haven't answered all the questions, but we'll keep those. We'll look at those. We'll look at how we can cover anyone through the duration of the project. So we'll get in touch with the details from this session, and also with the details of how you can book onto the next stage of our project, which is the workshops. And so what we're doing is we're running a series of 3-day workshops looking at those different aspects of the kind of planning and development process. So the first one, Saturday the 27th of January, and that's going to be hosted in the dance space, which is the big community building, which is a massive dance space at Circus Street. So that's going to be the one that's in situ in the development that we're talking about and looking at. And that's going to be, you know, to look at a development from the point of view of the people who are involved, the lives who were impacted, the people who were involved in the development process. Who do we need to talk to, and what questions do we need to ask of them? So that's going to be some training and some kind of community organizing skills for people who are interested in looking at that very human aspect of development and how it kind of impacts people. The second session is going to be on the planning process. So looking at the overall kind of planning and development process from that point at which sites get allocated to housing right through to where homes are delivered. So how that process works, what the kind of timeline of it is, what the different stages are, and critically, like, what are the points at which we can have an influence, what are those points of democratic engagement, and are there any other points? Because that's what we want to look at, right? Processes and how we can be involved to sort of shift them. And then the third workshop, which is not on Saturday the 2nd of March anymore, it's on Saturday the 9th of March, is on the money. So that's on where does the money come from and where does it go? And part of what we're going to be doing in that workshop is we're going to be looking at how you follow that money trail, what sort of pathways you need to take to do it, how you find that note on page 64 where the really shady deals are kind of hidden. How company and ownership structures work, so that ownership from the very much like we're looking at ownership in this project in a kind of who it's for sense, but you know, also that like who does own and who does benefit kind of financially from those homes, and also from a council perspective, because at the moment we're looking at council land, we're looking at developments on council land because following that kind of idea that it's, you know, public land, so therefore public good as well, and something we can maybe more easily, if not easily, have an influence on. So what the options are for councils in terms of what development options there are on their sites. On all of the workshop, there's going to be a mix of, there's guest speakers, there's kind of experts in each of those fields, and it's going to be a mixture of kind of presentations and interactive discussions that start to build this research picture of Circus Street. So you're welcome to come along to one or all of those, as many as you like. Obviously, what we're hoping is that the people who get involved will want to carry out some of the research during the research period. But if you were just interested in them, just, you know, come along and join those and learn some of those kind of, you know, skills and knowledge to sort of interrogate this, what seems often quite a like difficult and opaque process more thoroughly. So then we go into the research period, and the idea of the research period is that groups coming out of the training will form around the areas that they're interested in, will go out and carry out some of that research that we've been training people in the workshops to do. And we'll keep in touch with each other, and we'll keep in touch with us as the working group for support to see where that leads. And that's going to be about a couple of months, and that period's going to last, and then we're going to have a hackathon. And my housemate Suf was the one who introduced. I hadn't heard of a hackathon before. The idea of the hackathon is a space where we draw together the community researchers with designers, artists, people who are good at kind of condensing and presenting information, to look at how we can present those results that we've gathered and analysed over the period in an accessible and engaging form that we can then present to policymakers. And the last part of the project is that we host an event with policy and decision makers in the city to look at what we've learned, and critically what we've learned about what points of intervention were and could have been, in order to look at how we could do things differently in the future. It's really, I think it's probably important to say that while this project is like a 6-month project, the aim of it has always been to like see what happens when you gather people to kind of look at these things on a kind of citywide level, to see where it takes us, to see what people are interested in finding out, to look at what we've gathered and what we've missed. But what we'd really like is to kind of scale that up and make it a much larger scale project, and sort of develop a methodology that we can use to kind of analyse different developments in the city and ones that are in process at the moment, either for practices of resistance or for practices of trying to shape some of those decisions going forward. So very immediately, have a watch of the, very immediately, if you haven't already, watch Push. It is a great film. Look at some of these links and keep an eye out for that email. And yeah, it would be great to see some of you on those workshops that we're hosting. 5 minutes.
No, that was so, you know, that's bang on. Thank you. Well done. I mean, and so that's it. We've come to the end of the session today. I'd just like to say again, thank you so much to all of our panelists and contributors and everyone's help, everyone's great questions. I think we've touched on some really very, very important subjects, and I think those themes are what's going to continue through the project. And I look forward to seeing you all again in person, hopefully, at some of the workshops